over the course of the conversation, I asked the rather naive question, when will Sweden join NATO? Not for decades, they said. We've been trying to make the case and it just isn't there. Well, less than 3 years since those discussions in Sweden, it has now become the 32nd member of the alliance and turned the Baltic Sea into what Twitter has dubbed Lake NATO. But more importantly, it has offered Sweden an extra guarantee of its sovereignty. The question then is, what changed in that time? The obvious answer is that the Russian regime launched a genocidal war against the Ukrainian people, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of thousands in Europe's most deadly armed conflict in decades. That a new axis of Russia, China, and Iran has set out to disrupt the international rules-based system, and that for the first time since the 1940s, democracy looks to be on retreat around the world. However, I would argue something more profound took place in that time, which is a rediscovery of the need for a collective resolve when it comes to defense of the West and its values. I say this because in the past few years, some truths have been laid bare that we have ignored for far too long. That the post-war, post-communist international rules-based consensus has faded, that we as the collective West wasted the unipolar moment and what Fukuyama described as the end of history, and that in the absence of a strong West, we have allowed autocratic forces to regroup. Of course, this didn't start with Hamas's attack on Israel in October 2023, or Russia's attack on Ukraine in 2022, or the return of the Taliban in Afghanistan in 2021, or with the erosion of democracy in Hong Kong in 2020, or even with the rise of Iran in the Middle East. This is the culmination of decades of decline at the hands of a political class that has been so focused on the pursuit of vanity projects that it has simply forgotten how to make the case for a free society and our democratic way of life. The pursuit of pluralism and tolerance has resulted in the collapse of both of what Karl Popper once described as the paradox of tolerance. And in the absence of anyone making the strong case for a free society, we have seen a dangerous alternative emerge. Autocrats are beginning to appear across the globe, including in places that never had to contend with them in the first place. Only earlier this year, I was in Georgia in the South Caucasus, a country that in 2010 was the poster child for post-Soviet republic on the way to becoming a full member of the EU and NATO. Western leaders from across the political divide heralded the progress made in developing a vibrant economy and a strong participatory democracy. And yet, whilst I was there, the signs of Western decline were obvious. A country that had once been seen as the role model of a development of Central and Eastern Europe was in the midst of turmoil and democratic backsliding. A kleptocratic government led by a pro-Russian oligarch was in the process of banning civil society groups and independent media, copying a law that had already been deployed and destroyed those same institutions in Russia a decade ago. Georgian security services have assaulted opposition politicians in the street and in a campaign of intimidation targeting the families and homes of activists. This included the 12-year-old daughter of a think tank director I met with, who received threatening anonymous calls from pro-government agents. And yet, despite all of these risks, as I stood in front of the parliament several nights in a row, Georgian students and young people protested in defiance of this intimidation, waving their national flag alongside those of the US, UK, EU, and NATO, desperately clinging to the idea that the West would come to help them. So far, it has not. And now it has become clear that this legislation is being copied elsewhere. In the Republic of Srpska, the Serb part of Bosnia-Herzegovina, the paramilitary-backed regime has introduced a similar law, which is also harassing the democratic opposition. And in Central Asia, the same model of authoritarianism is being cemented with the help of Beijing and Moscow. Authoritarian states are trying to offer a new model for nations to follow, one that focuses on concentrating power amongst a small group of kleptocrats, kept in power for the purposes of backing Russia, China, and Iran in international institutions such as the UN. This new axis has shown how effective it can be at controlling the narrative at the United Nations. Just look at how it was able to support Iran and its proxies in the Middle East, demonizing Israel in favor of supporting the Islamist group Hamas, the only democracy in the Middle East treated as a pariah state. But what is it that really defines this new alliance of Russia, China, North Korea, Venezuela, Hamas, and others? Well, it's hard to find things that they have in common, as unlike in the Cold War, they do not share an ideology. Instead, what unifies them is an entente of hatred of everything which the free world stands for. Rather than having something in common, it is their opposition to our way of life that binds them together. But perhaps more than anything, it's their lack of belief in human dignity. Allow me for a moment to elaborate on this absence with an example that I believe we can all relate to, a short analogy of which I believe we will all find something in common. Suppose one morning that you wake up and you decide you haven't caught up with an old friend for a while. So you decide to send them a text asking to meet for coffee. They agree and you climb into your car. You drive to the cafe and you order your drink. Whilst you wait there for them to arrive, you sit there quietly and listen to the tedious cafe music that's often playing in the background. They arrive and you start catching up and you talk about work, family, friends, perhaps politics and current affairs, and at the end you say your goodbyes and you part ways. To us, this sounds like the most perfectly normal way to spend a morning, almost to the extent that we may think that it's trivial. In fact, it's so routine that it is trivial. And yet every single part of that story in one place or another in the unfree world is a crime. To spontaneously meet a friend is impossible or heavily controlled in countries like North Korea and China, whilst in Afghanistan or Iran it is a crime for women to do so without a male chaperone. In Xinjiang, in China, ethnic Uyghurs are forbidden from gathering in groups larger than 2 people in public. That annoying music that you were listening to in the background is a crime in Iran and Afghanistan. And in fact, listening to any kind of music is outlawed under the Taliban, where the first act that they carried out was to destroy musical instruments in the street. Whilst in North Korea, 2 teenagers were recently sentenced to a decade of hard labor in a concentration camp for listening to K-pop, the same music that sells out entire arenas in Europe and America. Talking about politics in public places in any of these countries will get you into trouble as well. I think of a recent story in which a couple at a restaurant were violently arrested in Russia for criticizing the war, only because they were overheard by someone sitting at a neighboring table. It is only when you stop and think about just how lucky we are to enjoy these small freedoms, the trivial ones, that you start to realize how privileged we are to have the big ones as well. Democracy, the rule of law, the right to free association. And this is what brings me on to the moral case for NATO and the West. Those freedoms that we enjoyed and those in the unfree world do not, come at a price, and that price is our constant vigilance, something that we have until recently forgotten how to do. NATO was originally founded at the height of the Cold War as a means of defending Western Europe and democratic values. In those days, it was clear who was on which side, the forces of the free world with NATO and the unfree world with the Soviet Union, and yet it all became confused. When the Cold War ended, there was a period in which it wasn't clear that what NATO was useful for anymore. Countries in Central and Eastern Europe that had been enslaved by Russia and communism were now free, and they joined the Western Club. What the Czech author Milan Kundera describes as the return of the kidnapped West. We were supposed to be living through the unipolar moment and enjoying the peace dividend. And indeed, it is unpopular to say, but Francis Fukuyama was to an extent right. History had indeed ended. However, people ignore the core warning of the book, and that we must stay on guard and ensure that liberal democracy had truly won. And instead of taking advantage of that time that we had to reshape the world in our image, as many people wanted to, least of all living in the unfree world, we wasted that time and gave space to new autocrats to emerge. We criminally underestimated China. We thought we could ignore Iran, and we made the mistake of thinking that just because Russia was no longer Tsarist or communist, that it would give up its imperial ambitions. We were wrong on all accounts, partly because it was inconvenient to admit so. Between Germany and France capitalizing on the new relationship with Russia and China, and the United States slowly retreating from the world in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, we set ourselves up for failure. We ignored the moral responsibility to promote democracy and free society, and instead opened up discussions about leaving room for coexistence and understanding. All that did was give an excuse for autocrats, authoritarians, and theocrats to move in to impose their own values against the will of thousands and millions of people. This leads me to one of the key differences between us and them, which is that whilst NATO enlarges as a voluntary association of free states, the axis of Russia, China, and Iran expand through robbing the people of their dignity and their sovereignty. We believe in choice of our politicians, of our alliances, and of how we structure our societies, whilst they believe in the imposition of their own values. If we truly believe, as I sincerely do, that the Western way of living is better than the alternative, then we have no choice but to once again rally as the West and do so. NATO is now once again the front line of our civilizational struggle to preserve free society. The realization has finally set in, and those who hate our way of life and are not content just to talk about it, but are compelled to do something. The image of protesters in Georgia waving the NATO and EU flags next to their own is burnt into my memory. It shows the tremendous power that these symbols have for people who believe in a better and freer world for future generations. Indeed, it is burnt into my memory alongside a visit to Kiev for the first time in 2015 and walking along the rubble of the Maidan Square in the aftermath of the protest that toppled the pro-Russian government. As I walked down Volodymyrsky descent towards the Europsky Ploshad, I noticed once again the NATO flag, this time used as a sign of European freedom and solidarity. We owe it to those people who still believe in and aspire to be part of the Euro-Atlantic world and who now in Ukraine are spilling their blood to uphold the highest standards of the Western world. We must reignite the values that Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and John Paul II utilized to help win the Cold War, and return to a vision of a West as the shining city upon a hill, confident, proud, and defiant against those who would seek to topple us. After all, were it not for everything that NATO does to defend us, we would not be having this conversation at all. Were we right now in Belarus or some other nation in the grip of an autocrat, the police would have already kicked down the door and sentenced the lot of us for a decade of hard labor for no other reason than gathering for the free exchange of ideas. We live in a position of a privilege in freedom. And rather than do what the left would have us do, which is to be ashamed of it, I would rather be proud of it. We should aspire to live in a world in which we can have discussions openly and in which our children can go to school, in which we can vote freely in elections and hold our politicians to account, and in which we can safely go for coffee with our friends. NATO isn't just about how many tanks and planes and ships we have, but it's about the values that those tools are used to defend, about the freedoms that the people who operate them enjoy. And we should never for a moment take our free society for granted, but instead treasure it for the next generation so that we can keep having meetings like this. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Rob, that was one of the most inspirational talks so far. I was beginning to think that the secret purpose of this conference was actually to have each presenter outdo the others on who can present a more dire and depressing view of the future. Rob seems to have not gotten that secret memo and said something rather positive. So I'll correct that deficit. So in 2004, I took an oath of office when I joined the Pentagon, and I said something which I didn't think about too much at the time, but I committed to defending the Republic against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Now, I had a pretty clear idea of the enemies that were foreign. I'd gone to graduate school, studied security studies, knew that China was ascendant, that radical Islam had attacked the United States, both the Pentagon where I was working, as well as the Twin Towers and elsewhere, and that China was ascendant. Russia was had some grievances and was going to cause lots of trouble, and of course that Iran wanted to change the regional balance of power in the Middle East. The domestic threats, the domestic enemies that we're supposed to protect, I thought, well, that's not the problem of the Department of Defense. That's something that the FBI does, local law enforcement. But what surprised me, and what I didn't know at that time, but I only learned later, was that a very formidable, and I would call even an existential threat, not only to the United States, but to the West as a whole, would emerge from what I observed, which was a somewhat secret alliance between those enemies, foreign and domestic. And I will explain that now. It's partly, actually rather extensively covered in this book that's going to come out in several months. I first realized that there was something wrong, gravely wrong, in the year 2009. And Barack Obama had just been elected president. And I know that for many of you very young people, Barack Obama seems like ancient history. But the legacy of Barack Obama is living very large in the United States to this day. And I do believe that legacy is a transnational legacy and affects your countries in Europe as well. In 2009, Obama decided to present America to the world in a different way, in a way that had actually never been done before. It was really quite extraordinary. He went around the world and he apologized for America's conduct of foreign policy historically. He had adopted and promoted this view that America had been discourteous. Before the Turkish parliament, he said that America had been dismissive of foreign cultures. From a podium at Cairo University in Egypt, he also blamed America's democratic allies for somewhat, white imperialist behavior, which, he thought was quite horrible. He laid the blame at the feet of Israel for the pain and dislocation of the Palestinian people exclusively. There was no one but to blame for Israel. He painted Israel as not a country inhabited by its indigenous Jewish population, but by some Europeans who had been given this country as a Holocaust sympathy sop. And he then went on, moved on to Strasbourg, France, where he said from that soil, which the U.S. military had liberated twice in the last century from tyranny, he said that America wasn't really a very exceptional nation after all. And no president had ever done this before in history, and there was actually some significant fallout. The American people, really from all sides of the political spectrum, really took offense at this characterization of America as not exceptional, as imperialist, as not a force of good in the world. And the polling at that time, projected it. So what did Obama do? I mean, after all, he's a politician. He needs to win re-election. He needs his popularity up. Instead of responding to the American people from both sides of the aisle, who found this vision rather abhorrent, he canceled the American people in the terminology that we use these days. How did he do that? He set out to accomplish clandestinely, internally, what he could not do openly. Now, in the year 2015, Hillary Clinton, who had been his Secretary of State and was really actually a student of Obama's in many respects, she characterized what they were doing this way. She said, "I don't believe you change hearts. You don't change hearts. You change laws. You change allocation of resources. You change the way systems operate." And what she was referring to was governance. How do you govern the state? You don't change hearts. So in other words, the founders, the framers of the US Constitution, they were students of the Enlightenment. They envisioned Americans coming into the public square, debating, hashing things out, and through a refiner's fire of discourse, we would get truth, we would get wisdom, we would get good solutions to practical problems. a lot of America's most ancient universities, specifically the Ivy League, that are now occupied by terrorist sympathizing students, have mottos such as Veritas or Lux e Veritas, searching for truth, searching for light, that really is about as American as it can get. But she was saying, no, you don't change hearts and minds. That's for fools. You generate complexity through laws and rules and regulations and policies. You have ways of shifting money around to favor those that you ideologically believe in and disfavor the ones you don't. And you change the way systems operate. You weaponize government. That's really, in many respects, what it's become. So this is what happened. Now, for those of you who've studied the Cold War, when the Soviet Union collapsed, we got the U.S. intelligence and specifically British intelligence got their hands on a remarkable treasure trove of documents from inside the KGB and other of Russia's security services. And what those documents showed, if you were to sort of take it all and condense it, it revealed regarding America that Soviet agents had penetrated all aspects of our government. They had stolen, gotten their hands on pretty much all the best research and development that we'd completed and generated, and they, really, there's pretty much nothing, no aspect of American society of consequence that they hadn't sort of, penetrated in many respects, been able to control in some ways. Despite all of that, they still lost. They lost. And the reason why they lost is that their system was so rotten that even if they had all of this information, all this knowledge, and they brought it back, they still could not put it to use and to win. And so what is the lesson that they gathered from that? The lesson that the Soviets gathered, and which the Chinese have taken to heart, and the Iranians as well, is that they can't win, so they're going to make us lose. And the reason, and the way they're going to do that is to make us as much like them as possible. Why are they so obsessed with this? The Chinese, specifically, the Iranians extremely, also the Russians, fear their own people more than they fear us. They know that as long as there's a shining city on a hill, as long as there's a light unto nations, as long as the West is attractive to their people, that their people are an existential threat to their regimes. Make America, make the West as much like these authoritarian regimes as possible, their people will have nowhere to turn. They will have no hope. This is the strategic objective. This conference, I'm a practitioner. I'm not a political philosopher. In retrospect, I wish I had studied political philosophy, but this conference has been very eye-opening for me. There are some, themes that have been discussed, and I've been thinking about this, plan of our enemies to make us like them, and I think that they're actually doing a very successful job. Our countries are becoming more authoritarian, like them. Our countries are repressing free speech, like it happens in their country. Our country, my country, the United States, and I believe yours as well, I've actually discussed this with several of you, the rule of law is no longer blind. There are several tiers of justice. There is justice for the privileged, and there's justice for the ordinary people, and even another form of justice for the disfavored. Law is no longer blind. And in many respects, as I've laid out in my book rather depressingly, exhaustively, is that a lot of these the administrative state, some might want to call it the deep state, they're free to completely ignore the law and the facts. They don't matter. They can make it up and get away with it and bear no consequences. And if you think that's bad, it gets much worse. So, under the Clintons specifically, the Clintons, they were in power when the Soviet Union collapsed, and the U.S. government vastly transformed. There was a lot of privatization. A lot of things that used to be done by the government were sort of sent to the private sector. The Clinton family made hundreds of millions of dollars in this process because they made a lot of friends by privatizing government functions and industries, et cetera. There's so much money that's sloshing around Washington. And a new development, it's always been there, but specifically with the rise of China's wealth, it's become rather staggering, is that a lot of the money in Washington, D.C. comes from our enemies. And now there's even a saying in Washington that the easiest money comes from our enemies. If you're a government official and you were voted out of office, or you decided to leave your job somewhere in the U.S. government and become a consultant, if you want to make money and you want to do it easily, you can go to our enemies. Think tanks are funded by, the Brookings Institution is funded by Qatar. China gives money to all sorts of think tanks. It's become so normalized. And so when that happens, you get a very, you get a real problem developing. The director of Central Intelligence under Obama, a guy who is rather reprehensible named John Brennan, knows what he's talking about. In May of 2017, he said, frequently, this is before the U.S. House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, he said, frequently, individuals, these are just Washington types, who go along a treasonous path do not even realize they're along the path until it gets a bit too late. What he's talking about is America's enemies have so sort of shaped the professional industries of Washington, D.C. to favor them, to make the incentives so deliciously irresistible to support their interests, that American officials go down a treasonous path and they don't even know it. They're being led. Russian intelligence besmirch and tarnish individuals. They use blackmail. This happens a lot. Blackmail. The blackmail of U.S. officials and even distinguished sort of peoples of the foreign policy community, et cetera. This is something that our enemies spend a huge amount of time generating, and they're actually quite good now of even sort of making it up and having that pass to smear people who are threatening to them, just because, and part of the structure that makes that so effective is that within especially national security, if you have a security clearance, that's not a right, that's sort of privilege, and you can suspend it, you can get rid of it, very easily just based upon suspicions. And of course, the Russians and the Chinese or the Iranians know that, so they can besmirch people they don't like by playing into that sensitivity. So our enemies, they leverage this for their own purposes. Russian agencies coerce treason from U.S. officials who do not even realize they are on that treasonous path until it gets too late. So that's what they do, and they're very good at it. So, just last month, there was really a remarkable report that came out of the U.S. House of Representatives. Actually, 3 committees, put this together. And what did they find? They found that President Biden monetized the office of the vice president while he was under Obama by taking tens of millions of dollars from foreign interests, and he actively worked to conceal the conspiracy. That's a quote. Where did that money come from? America's greatest strategic adversary. Biden took funds directly from the Chinese Energy Fund Committee, a company owned and operated by the Chinese Communist Party and run by China's intelligence services. But this has become rather normalized. Senior U.S. officials taking money from our enemies. So this, really, unholy alliance between enemies, foreign and domestic, right now it's at a level that I don't think has ever existed in human history. I would encourage you to keep this in mind when you look at the conduct of U.S. foreign policy. With this level of, I would say, infiltration and coercion and treason and collaboration, it wouldn't surprise me that this is actually playing a significant role in the conduct of U.S. foreign policy. I know that's a rather extreme thing to say, but I do lay out the evidence in my book. And that's something that, well, when I was your age, I wouldn't have believed it, but I do believe it exists. I believe that the Iran deal under Obama was very much, to balance our democratic ally Israel with a nuclear Iran. I have no doubt that Obama was collaborating with the Russians to win the 2012 election. He was even provided talking points by President Medvedev that he mouthed on national television. And our pivot to Asia has been described by the senior strategist in the Pentagon, who remains there to this day, as something that is not serious. And in fact, he has said, and I quote, "Losing Taiwan to China would not be an insult to U.S. national interests." So this is very serious stuff indeed. I see that I'm running out of time. I believe we're in uncharted territory. 2,000 years ago, Marcus Tullius Cicero observed that a nation can survive its fools and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within. An enemy at the gates is less formidable, for he is known and carries his banner openly, but the traitor moves amongst those within the gate freely, his sly whispers rustling through all the alleys, heard in the very halls of government itself. Well, that was Cicero's assessment of how a nation cannot survive. But the description of what's happening today is the enemy is not only outside the gates, the enemy is inside the gates, and the enemy is collaborating over the gates. With that happy ending, I shall turn it over to our distinguished member of the Irish Army.
Good afternoon. Just to clarify, I'm not a serving member now, more of a private citizen. So, thank you, Robert, for giving us a very succinct overview, and indeed thanks to Adam for his incisive, insightful, and indeed intriguing peer into what appears to be an abyss opening up over in the public sphere in the United States, and maybe has relevance for us on this side of the Atlantic. However, I'm going to step back into my lane, which is to talk to you a little bit about European defence and perhaps more pertinently Ireland's positioning in that, and to give you maybe a little bit of a whistle-stop tour of that architecture, and hopefully not bore you all to tears, bearing in mind that it is the after-lunch slot, which all speakers know is the land of death when it comes to speaking. But I don't see anybody with matchsticks under their eyes yet. So far, so good. And I know what that's like from my days in the military college when we used to have to try all kinds of innovative ways to keep ourselves awake, or else be doomed to press-ups and runs ad infinitum. So, I was recently on a trip over to NATO headquarters, which popped back into my head when Robert made reference to NATO from a moral perspective. And I was visiting with some colleagues in the US mission to NATO, and also in SHAPE, which some of you that are, I'm sure, well versed in these matters, is more the military operational side of NATO. There's the NATO headquarters in Brussels, which is very bureaucratic, and it's mostly civilians that you're dealing with there. And at SHAPE, the supreme headquarters of the Allied powers in Europe, it tends to be more, I would say, where the rubber meets the road and getting to understand what NATO does and how it does it. And probably the most interesting chat I had was with a delightful German colonel in the Directorate of Operations there, called Colonel Frank Jewell, coming up for retirement. So he was very direct in his comments. And two things are very apparent. One is that NATO is very much a defensive alliance. And their posture, their presence, their profile is about being able to deter and defend. Now, you wouldn't always get that impression when you listen to public commentary in Ireland with regards to that, although there has been a shift of gravity in that space in more recent times, of which I'll touch on a little bit later. One of the implications of a defensive alliance is also that it's based on consensus. And so much so, just to give you a little bit of an operational insight into the implications of that, there is a NATO maritime mission that's patrolling outside, just outside the shall we say, the combat zone of the war that's taking place between Ukraine and Russia, and trying to give protection to the maritime activities that are going on there, and to try and give support where possible to the Ukrainians. However, the members that supply the assets for that do so on an individual basis and have caveats involved in those kinds of things. This is the case on a lot of multinational operations, a number of which I've served on myself, where the nation state supplying the assets can have them redirected to national concerns, national objectives. So imagine this, you're maybe the admiral in charge of this maritime mission, and you're dealing with a number of member states who have supplied X amount of naval assets to you, and at any given time you can receive through the chain of command a notification that the Dutch maybe, or the Italians or the British have decided to pull out one or two of their vessels for a national related objective. They managed to work around it, but I'm just using that as an example to remind you that these are not, while they may seem militarily inconsistent, and they create headaches for operational planners such as Colonel Jewell and his colleagues, they're not the acts of an autocratic, aggressive institution. They reinforce, as far as I'm concerned, the fact that NATO is very much a community of nations that are engaged in collective defence. And collective defence works. It's part of the reason that Europe has largely been at peace. And even when it wasn't at peace, such as the descent into chaos in the Balkans, it was one of the significant geopolitical tools or mechanisms available to the international community to restore peace. What's interesting about NATO now is also interesting from the European Union perspective, something of which Ireland is roundly committed to. And that is an evolving relationship. There are a number of perhaps stumbling blocks, but one thing is apparent, and the body politic in Ireland is starting to gradually come to grips with understanding this, is that NATO and the European Union have been developing a very strong sense of a strategic relationship. It's still not worked out yet. In some ways, they're still at the operational level, still competitors for assets, because obviously most of the membership of both NATO and the European Union are drawn from the same pool of nations. And that's something that will need to be ironed out and need to be addressed, particularly when it comes to figuring out ways to protect things such as the new area that has become very sexy for both organisations, termed CUI, Critical Underwater Infrastructure, and of course which has become very much a point of concentration for us here in Ireland for obvious reasons, with not just the undersea cables but some other reasons that will develop perhaps in time. So what we're seeing now, in broad brush strokes, is that NATO isn't just, it's a defence organisation with a capital D, but it is evolving too to become more of a political organisation, or a political alliance with a small p. Because the NATO infrastructure realises that developing its political side as an alliance is hugely important to maintaining the commitment of its members, but reassuring those who are non-members, but regions of the world where it has to do business, where it has to engage. And while that, of course, includes and refers to the global south, it's broader than that, because one of the things that NATO ventured into doing, and hasn't given up on, by the way, is becoming a strategic partner with the United Nations. Back in, I think it was 1996, Kofi Annan, the then General Secretary of the United Nations, wished that there was a NATO equivalent in Africa that he could subcontract missions to. Because NATO has a well-structured command and control system. To boil it down to sporting parlance, it enables all the players to train together, have a common understanding of the rules before they take to the pitch. I was going to say on All-Ireland final day, or maybe I should say on Super Bowl Sunday, or delete and insert whatever national competition you're familiar with in sporting terms. People who have a military background realise the importance of command and control and interoperability. And that's where, from an Irish perspective, NATO has played a hugely important role. Most of you, if you're of an Irish background, may not be aware that Ireland has developed a fairly close interoperable role with NATO since we got involved with the Partnership for Peace, which is now, I think, almost 20 years ago. The Partnership for Peace, as many of you will know, was created as a sort of a mechanism to allow particularly the Eastern European and Baltic states to get themselves up to a standard for NATO membership, a sort of a waiting room for membership. But then it became more sophisticated. It became a mechanism by which countries that were never going to join NATO, which included Russia, by the way, could develop an operational relationship, a partnership where relevant. To be able to, at the very least, if not cooperate, but to coordinate with NATO missions and NATO forces. So for Ireland, it became very, very beneficial because it allowed us upscale our capabilities in terms of training, in terms of preparing our understanding about operating at levels beyond which our military would normally get to do so. So if you were to look at Irish troops on parade today, of the slightly more younger generation, when they're wearing their formal uniform and wearing, as is the case with troops on parade, wearing their medals, and you look closely at them, you'll see quite an array of medals. And they're not for, commemorations or other makey-up things that can be the case in some other organisations in Ireland. They're to do with service. And they're a mix of UN service medals, EU service medals, and NATO service medals. In fact, I would say Irish soldiers that enlisted and served in the period of the mid-90s into the early noughties, probably the majority of their medals were NATO-related. So the bottom line was that Irish troops could serve on missions that fulfilled the mandate and ideas of Irish foreign policy. And the one problem with that, as some of you are probably aware of, was what was known as the triple lock mechanism. So this was something that was devised, not purely in response to the Lisbon Treaty, as some people think, a European Union treaty. But back in 1960, when Ireland was committing its first large body of troops to an overseas UN operation, and it was to stop mission creep. It was to ensure that Irish troops could only be deployed with the assent of our Parliament, the Dáil, Dáil Éireann, the government of the day, and the third element of the lock, the assent of the United Nations. And the idea was that we wouldn't get sucked into some weird United Nations adventure, although I can tell you the Congo was a pretty weird adventure, if any of you have ever read about it. Because the belief was in certain quarters that joining the United Nations meant that Ireland was deviating from its path, its stance as a neutral nation. Fast forward to the era we live in now, and you have extreme elements in the Irish left who would have us believe that the only way Ireland can maintain its neutral stance is to retain the triple lock. In other words, to give the say-so of deployment of Irish troops to the members of the UN Security Council, because various Irish attorneys general interpreted the triple lock from that perspective. So I'm sure you'll be pleased to know that Ireland is in the process of restoring its sovereignty in those matters, in those decision-making matters, by adjusting the legislation about that in order that we will not be dependent on the whims of the UN Security Council and when we can deploy troops. I used to often find myself in debates with various people about these matters, and a question would be levelled at me as to, well, how many times has it happened that Ireland has had to pull out of a UN mission? Well, there was one significant one, the European Union mission to Macedonia, which had a UN mandate. And so basically, once it had a UN mandate, whether it was EU or NATO-led, Ireland could participate. But in this case, the Chinese were dragging their heels because apparently I think the Macedonians had recognized Taiwan in some formal setting. So all of these things that were not directly relevant to Ireland's participation in the mission were having an effect and resulted in the pulling out of Irish military and police personnel from that mission. And then there were a number of other missions that we didn't pull out of, but we didn't take part in because of issues to do with Security Council endorsement. And when I would make this point, my opponents would very say, well, that's just one example. I mean, can you give me another? How many examples to assaults on your sovereignty do you need before you decide to take action and adjust these kinds of things? And the reason I share that little vignette with you is just to remind you that one of the problems we have in Ireland with regards to defence in Europe is our interpretation of it, our understanding of it. We have ceded the territory for a common sense comprehension and of understanding of where we are at the moment with regards to our geopolitics. There are some on the extreme end of the Irish left who would have us believe that our neighbours and our natural allies exist in a conglomerate of Eastern Europe, Africa and other faraway places. And when I say far away, I'm not just talking about geography, I'm talking about values and shared concepts of rule of law. So the reality is we exist in Western Europe. We are part of the West. We have always understood that. We like to use terms in Ireland that nobody else uses, just to keep our Hibernian uniqueness. We use a term like neutrality, which is probably, we hibernicize it to make it the most bastardized word in the English language. Because we'll then add things like, well, Ireland isn't really, it's not politically neutral, we're just militarily neutral. And what does that mean? It's like saying I'm a little bit pregnant, but don't look now. We'll deal with that unseemly aspect and go back to being pristine. That has been the kind of stance that Ireland has taken geopolitically. We've sort of tried to walk both sides of the fence. And the reality is, if you read some of the various writings that look on Ireland's development as a nation from the period of the lead up to the Second World War onwards, and I'll just throw out a few names. Professor Ewan O'Halpin has written Defending Ireland, the Irish State and Its Enemies since 1922, or was it 24? More recently, Conor Gallagher, security correspondent with the Irish Times, wrote an excellent, very accessible book called Is Ireland Really Neutral? I think it was published last year just in time for the forums on international security and defence. And there are a few other variations in between. But if you read either of those titles, it becomes abundantly clear that Ireland has had a very close relationship with its Western partners when it comes to intelligence sharing, when it comes to engaging in what could best be described as covert activities rather than overt activities. Now, we've been fortunate because we do not live in a neighbourhood where we are likely to suffer a full spectrum threat That is a full-scale seaborne or airborne invasion. Why? Because NATO are going to prevent something like that. It's not in their interests, it's not in our interests. And the body politic in Ireland has largely been happy with that. It's allowed us to sail under the flag of, under the umbrella, I should say, of NATO protection without having to confront the difficult politics of debating and discussing and educating and enlightening our mainstream citizenry as to the consequences of that. And the consequences of that for Ireland have been that we have opted out of decision making. And now we're waking up to it. And we're realising that we cannot go it alone with regards to security and defence. And we're starting to also address the issue of what are our threats, because we live in a threat landscape. The entire world does not love us just because we're cute and Irish. Much and always we would like to be everybody's friend. You can't be everybody's friend if you take a values stance. If you believe in a rule of law-based society, if you believe in human rights, you're going to have enemies. So from Ireland's perspective, we're now obsessing about our critical underwater infrastructure. And as a result of that, what we're doing strategically is developing a series of partnerships. We're becoming defence compliant on the quiet, as it were, in a way that won't frighten the horses, in a way that our population can gradually acclimatise to, and in a way that doesn't bind us completely. So Robert mentioned Sweden and Finland and their ascent into NATO. I don't think you'll be seeing Ireland join NATO anytime soon. It's still too difficult a hot potato for any Irish politician to try and carry over the line. But you know, it's probably not going to make too much difference because, as I said, the level of strategic cooperation existing between and developing between NATO and the EU is meaning that Ireland has had to develop and is developing defence cooperation mechanisms that politically and legally allow us to be where we need to be, both for our own benefits and for our partners' benefits. So the first pertinent example of that is, and you may be aware of this, we've recently signed up to what's called an individual tailored partnership plan with NATO. So this allows Ireland to get involved with various subgroups and cooperate, share intelligence, share technical expertise, and to some extent eventually hammer out sharing responsibilities with regards to securing critical infrastructure, undersea infrastructure, not just off Irish shores, but in the general area of northwestern Europe. There are other areas too. Within PESCO, you may be familiar with it, the Permanent Structured Cooperation Mechanism that has been developed within the European Union. We haven't leveraged it fully yet, but we have signed up to it and a number of subgroups within it. But the interesting thing about PESCO, and not a lot of people have picked up on it in Irish public life, is it allows for cooperation not just between like-minded European Union states. So, I mean, it's conceivable that Ireland and the Benelux countries could come together to seek or to share funds to develop an expeditionary asset such as a hospital ship, or to share expenses for medium lift aircraft, of which Ireland currently has none. Those are all good, sound, sensible, pragmatic things that are not too difficult to sell as a concept and a reason for doing so to the Irish public. But it also allows for cooperation with third-party countries. So it allows us within Ireland put on a more overt footing our security relationship with the United Kingdom, which is ultimately, I'd say, what NATO would like us to see do more, develop a bilateral defence relationship. And that's probably what you're going to see more of happening. There's already a 2015 Memorandum of Understanding signed between Ireland and the UK, which largely is talked about in terms of sharing knowledge about peacekeeping and other nice, fluffy terms like that. But the reality is it allows for a relationship. The wordy phrase Memorandum of Understanding is what will be used rather than anything like pact or alliance. Anything that has an Article 5 aspect to it, you know what I'm talking about, Article 5 from NATO, mutual defence. If Ireland signs up to something like that, it requires us to have a referendum to change the Constitution. So neutrality isn't in the Constitution. Most of my fellow citizens aren't aware of that. Thank God it isn't. I mean, the last thing you need are legal shackles. The last thing you need is a High Court judge making a decision about defence in time of crisis. Although, God knows, in Ireland, everybody gets to make serious decisions about defence except the people who are actually trained and tasked to carry out the duties. However, the reality of our progress, I think, will be found along the lines of development of a number of consensual, mutually beneficial cooperative relationships with the UK, within the European Union context, and under the ITPP within NATO, which will allow, most importantly, for our European and other partners, us to develop plug-in points. People often say to me, having been a professional soldier, albeit with a very small, oftentimes ill-equipped army, but sometimes that's a good thing. You learn how to do more with less. Why do we maintain a military? Why does Ireland need a military? And I would say sometimes I ask myself the same questions, because oftentimes my career and the thinking from a defence perspective has often been to do with the security of other nations, deploying Irish troops in support of, as I said, UN and EU-related missions and NATO-led missions, involved in the security and restabilisation of other parts of the world. It seems to be nearly a sin in Ireland to consider what we do in terms of defence for our own shores, the integrity of our own borders, the safety of our own people. However, by developing the relationship concept, it allows us to provide our partners, should a catastrophic situation arise that Ireland needed assistance, with a plug-in point to a command and control system within Ireland that works, a professional military that can task, that can coordinate partner nations as they arrive to the field, so to speak. So it allows you to retain your sovereignty in time of need and to engage in support with partner nations. A lot of people don't think about that, and that's not peculiar to Ireland. I would say that's peculiar to any part of the world. You may remember the earthquake in Haiti some years ago. Because Haiti wasn't functioning as a proper state, didn't have an armed forces, and notwithstanding a UN mandate to reconstruct Haiti, it required the US to go in and effectively annex the country for a period of, I think, nearly a year, just to get the platforms needed in order to bring the necessary aid in to rebuild the country and to rebuild civil society. And this was done, lest anyone think I'm accusing the US of a land grab, this was done in cooperation with the UN mission to reconstruct that country. So if you're really interested in maintaining your country's integrity and ability to protect itself, you maintain a competent professional armed forces that are properly mandated under the democratic governance. And that is, in a sense, what we're doing in Ireland, but we could be doing it better. And the cooperative system, I think, will allow us to do it better. So a couple of other points, I suppose, in terms of looking at how we see things develop on the defence front. And I hope maybe what I've done is maybe prompted you to think about things from a few perspectives, that you might have questions you want to answer or points you want to make, rather than me banging on at you for the next while. But I think the way you're going to see defence develop, I mean, the European Union is thinking very seriously now about defence. You're seeing, I think actually there was a defence commissioner appointed recently. You're going to see more of a challenge about this. Ireland recently elected its new European Union members of Parliament. And curiously enough, I'd say we were practically the only country, or one of very few, where neither prospective candidates nor the general public were talking about defence in Europe. And yet defence in Europe is going to be of immense importance to Ireland in the coming years, I think, anyway. Why is that? Remember earlier I said there was a point I was going to come back to? We're obsessed about the cables in Ireland as being our biggest weakness. And yet Ireland talks about wanting to become a repository of energy for Europe. And that's not a bad idea. You know, the creation of wind farms off the west coast in the Atlantic could make a considerable, if it was planned and done for properly, considerable difference to ensuring that Western Europe never again has to rely on totalitarian states for its energy resources. A major strategic blunder if there ever was. However, do we think such an interesting initiative is going to be left unmolested? Do we think in the current climate that somebody like Mr. Putin and others would not want to try and ensure such an idea was stillborn before it ever got off the ground? How do we protect these things? And I'm not just talking about kinetic responses. Protection as the new subgroup within NATO, and I think it's a shared subgroup between NATO and the EU with regards to critical undersea infrastructure, is looking at developing a marriage between the private sector, the public sector, governance, and the military with regards to undersea critical infrastructure protection. So this promises to be an innovative time for Europe, for Ireland, and if it's done right, a productive time. So it's an area to watch development of. From an Irish perspective, it's an area of crucial significance to us because our primary threats in the coming period, and actually as we speak, are going to be within the realm of the hybrid, or what's also known as grey zone warfare, which is weaponization of economics, politics. A good example would be, in recent times, you're no doubt aware of the upheaval there has been in this island and more pertinently across the water with our near neighbour, the United Kingdom, and of course up the road in Northern Ireland, the issue of migration, the weaponization of migrants. This isn't happening purely by accident. If you do a cursory glance of chat rooms across Western Europe that lean in certain directions, you can see old tropes being stirred up. You know, the Russian troll farms are very busy and very hard at work. And what they're trying to do, and what they've succeeded in doing, is not inventing points of descent, but just focusing on each nation and finding the existing points of descent. You've got to be culturally literate to do that. The Russians aren't brilliant at being culturally literate, but they don't have to be, because there's plenty of wise fools out there who only need to be wound up like a little Duracell bunny and sent marching off, uttering various emotion-laden slogans that will stir up and press tribal buttons. And the pressing of tribal buttons can have very unusual and unexpected consequences. And just to take Ireland as a little microcosm, a little example. So the extreme ideology that was brought out there by exercising particularly parts of Dublin, working class estates in Dublin, who were being bombarded with memes and online chatter about their resources being eaten up and migrants getting various things that they weren't going to get. It very quickly gets followed up by the whole concept of Ireland for the Irish, which then leads to the bizarre imagery of working class Dubliners who would lean towards extreme militant republicanism going up to wave the tricolour and march alongside militant working class loyalists in Northern Ireland. Now, you could say, isn't it great to see hands across the border? But the point being, we'd prefer not to see it with such an emotionally laden extremist ideology. There are better ways to deal with this. And of course, migration is an issue. It's a thorny issue that hasn't been well handled in Ireland because we don't tend to do over the horizon scanning or horizon scanning in a way that can lead to proper strategic objective setting. Most of the establishment, the civil service establishment in Ireland, did not expect the Ukrainian war to last longer than a couple of weeks, maybe months at best. But I suppose, to be fair to them, neither did most of Western Europe. And as a result, we didn't plan too well with regards to the huge volume of Ukrainian migrants that we have, or Ukrainian refugees, I should say, that we've had. And as a result, we created a fault line. Now, the point I'm making is those fault lines have been zeroed in on by those who have nefarious intent. And how do we combat that? How do we respond to things that turn our own people into potential assailants or into potential enemies of our own state? These are challenging things. It's easier to train yourself, as our Baltic partners and neighbours are doing, to prepare for hard-edged threats directly from Russia. But it requires more agility and mobility of thought to protect yourself from the non-kinetic threats, from the insidious threats of a mixture of disinformation, cyber attacks, weaponization of economics, these are the things that we will have to guard against, and we can only do so by partnership and cooperation with like-minded nations who share our values. So I'm going to conclude, leave it at that, and enjoy any questions or chats that you, or points that you want to make after this. Thank you.
I think if we have a microphone that we can bring to people, yeah. To the front first.
Thank you very much. I have two questions, maybe primarily for Adam. Can you comment on the statements from NATO General Secretary a few days ago, recognizing that the war in Ukraine will not be won in a battlefield, and to end the war, sooner or later there needs to be dialogue with Russia, but based upon Ukrainian strength, defense and deterrence? I don't know if that is just stating the obvious or if that represents something new in the situation. Also, I wonder about, I mean, in the past, European security has heavily relied on NATO and in particular the US. Can you give a brief comment about the isolationist groups in the US that want to leave Europe just left to itself, even to the extent of pulling out of NATO? Is that just media hysteria here in the West, or just tactics to make NATO member countries actually spend what they should spend? Or is there some truth to that in a scenario in the US? So, yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I'll address the second question first. So, there was a famous Speaker of the House of Representatives in the 1980s. His name was Tip O'Neill, an Irishman who became an American, and he was famous for a statement that all politics is local. So a lot of American foreign policy is, very much attuned to, the sensibility of the American people, particularly on, long-term commitments, like alliances and NATO. And a lot of Americans, NATO is somewhat structurally problematic from a mass, support standpoint, in that it's a defensive alliance. And so you only see the value of NATO when there's some sort of defensive thing that needs to take place. That makes it hard to get public support. There's also so that's one challenge. Another challenge is that there is the issue of payment of dues. I think a lot of ordinary Americans, I know certainly Trump himself and some of his advisors, view Europe as relatively wealthy, and there's some resentment that America's been really left to deal with a lot of the strategic threats around the world, the rise of China, or issues in the Middle East. Frankly, I don't know any Americans that really expect Europe to help us in the Western Pacific. We just don't, not seriously. But we do expect Europe to help us with challenges in their own backyard, and there's quite a bit of resentment, and the NATO war. The Russo-Ukrainian war is sort of an example of that. A lot of Americans are scratching their head. We're providing tens of billions of dollars for this. There's lots of strategic concerns around the world. Why are we doing this? Why is Europe not standing up? So I would not dismiss the concern of the U.S. really turning away from NATO and doing it gently and as diplomatically as possible. But there's concern that we're paying too much, we're expending too many resources. And there's another theme that is sort of a more strategic theme in the background, which has actually been a subject of conversation here the past 3 days, and that is there is a sense in the United States that Europeans don't believe in themselves, that Europe doesn't believe in Europe, that Europe doesn't believe in Western civilization. And so if Europe doesn't believe in itself, why should America believe in Europe? And this undergirds the whole discussion. So I hope that's a decent answer to your second question. In answer to your first question, yeah, as Clausewitz, famous Prussian military strategist said, victory is a matter of psychology. So what happens in the battlefield? Well, that's one thing, but victory and defeat occurs in the brain, in one's behavior. Absolutely, it won't be one on the battlefield. It'll be one in the minds of Putin or his successor and the Ukrainian leadership. So I don't know if did I answer that question okay, or were you looking for something else?
Well, maybe a bit more about, because there has been a lot of talk about we just need to continue more weapons, more materials, and we just need to push hard against Russia. So there hasn't really been a strong effort. Hey, we need dialogue. So who has been the people in the room arguing for dialogue? So it seems to me like this is coming from NATO. I mean, the Stoltenberg himself, it seems to be, wow.
Yeah.
But how are we going to do that? What needs to happen in order to do that?
Well, it's very clear to me that Ukraine's never been given the weapons they need to win. So there is clearly discussions in the halls of power. I wouldn't be, having been in many meetings in the Pentagon and the Joint Chiefs of Staff and with Pentagon senior leadership, I wouldn't be the least bit surprised that in the Biden Pentagon there are discussions of senior leadership who are saying, you know what, well, on one hand, if the Ukrainians win, well, that could mean that Russia could lose. And if Russia loses, maybe it becomes a failed state. This is a serious issue. If Russia loses, it can become a failed state with loose nuclear weapons. That will be America's problem. And certainly, nobody in the Biden administration wants that. So having Ukraine win could be a disaster for America. I wouldn't be the least bit surprised. This would never be discussed openly. But these are the discussions that happen behind closed doors. So that's number one. And I think in some respects, the proof of the pudding and the eating is that we just have never given the Ukraine the weapons they need. There was a lot of talk about combined arms operations. You need air power. You need air power for that. We did not. We gave the Ukrainians kind of everything else, but the critical air power they have not received. So it seems like we're designing our foreign policy for a stalemate, just grinding up the Russians and the Ukrainians so they both lose.
I think it was pointed out.
Could I respond to the gentleman there for a second as well? You're asking about negotiations. You don't negotiate if somebody's boot is on your throat. That's where Ukraine is at the moment. However, you don't negotiate either if the other party doesn't appear to be acting in good faith, and Russia isn't doing that. Russia is a slow learner. Look what happened to Russia in the 80s in Afghanistan. Russia isn't going to lose in the conventional sense. I don't fear what my colleague is worried about, although I get his point. Nobody would want to see Russia becoming a failed state. I think the West has been maybe too conservative about not giving the weaponry when it was needed, because there is that fear of maybe not just a failed state, but maybe a worse potentate coming into power, or Russia becoming more uncoordinated in how it lashes back. I think there's a big fear of that. However, I think it's been essential that Ukraine be supported in its fight, because it is going to end with negotiation in some shape or form. And how that happens, from Ukraine's point of view, has to be on as level a playing pitch as possible. So the Russians have to realize that they can't win this militarily. And I think, I'm a bit of an optimist, but I think they're learning that slowly but surely. I don't think Putin might maybe ever learn it, but I think those around him, as they feel the pain in some ways, and it could lead to a change in leadership within Russia, that might be the way out of it. I know this just to add an aspect to it.
And I know for a fact there's absolutely fear in some parts of Western Europe as well of defeating Russia. But one of the things that I find interesting is the fear of the idea of a collapse of Russia. One of the things that led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union was the war in Afghanistan. The Soviets basically put the Red Army through the meat grinder in Afghanistan. What happened, though, was that it wasn't Muscovite children who were being sent to Afghanistan. It was Armenians, Azerbaijanis, Belarusians, people from the Baltic states. Russia never fights with its own people. It uses its ethnic minorities because it sees them as disposable. And the same thing is happening again in Ukraine. If you look at the frontline troops being deployed in Ukraine, they're coming from Bashkir communities, from Kalmyk communities, from Tuvan communities, and it's breeding this kind of resentment. And I think there's a recognition that just as the Afghan war caused breakaway states from the Soviet Union. There's a fear that the same might happen again from the Russian Federation with these smaller minority groups. I think the next question was over there.
Yes, thank you very much. I have a question for Mr. Lovinger regarding China. Namely, I was watching some videos on YouTube of Richard Nixon's interviews, and I have seen he's a quite brilliant man. And then in the 80s, he was talking about, with some newspaper guy, why China chose the United States instead of the USSR. And he said this, that China doesn't care, China's ideology doesn't care about the ideology of the friend it chooses to choose. It just cares about if the friend will threaten the security of China. So this was his reasoning for the grand opening of China in the 70s. Do you see maybe that China today also has the fundamental belief it had 50 years ago? This is the first question. And the second question, so I had the luck to be twice in China. It's a magnificent place, as I have seen it, vast, developed. And then I have seen the culture we see also in the West. I have seen mobile phones, apps, large shopping centers. And I have seen that China wants to go back in the tradition of the Chinese people to get back the museums and so on and so on. But I have noticed that as they would like to go back, they would like to be like independent, they have embodied the things from the West and they cannot leave it. It will stay with them. As hard as they would like to be independent, some things from the West, some culturological things will stay with them. So do you think that this will also make an impact on China in the future? Thank you.
Yeah, so I agree with you on the first question. There, after when the People's Republic of China was created in 1947-48, I mean, it was created on Marxist, Leninist lines like the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was, a very attractive sort of model for China at that time, and naturally, both the USSR and the PRC, they gravitated towards one another. There emerged this, Russo-Chinese split because China did things that were very alarming to Moscow in terms of nuclear weapons and things that Mao said and some other things. And so I agree with you that its ideology is not what governs China's alliance strategy. It is genuinely, which great power is the greatest threat, and they will naturally sort of align with another one. Just looking at the history of Russo-Chinese relations, there's a lot of animosity between these two countries. Both of them are very proud civilizations and look down on one another. So there's many factors that divide them. But I do believe that right now at this particular moment, they are united both because they fear the West and the U.S. Primarily for the reasons I discussed, which is that we're very attractive to their people, and they know that they can't ever deliver this level of attractive society. But also because in some respects they really feel that victory is in sight at the same time. They've really managed to recognize the West's strategic weaknesses. Some of you may not know this, but the student protests that are at American Ivy League universities, the greatest foreign sponsor that's funding this is China. And it's not because they care one whit about the Palestinians or the Israelis. It's a divide and conquer strategy. So our enemies have really discovered that the openness, the liberal democracies in the West are really just extremely open and vulnerable for the taking. So much so, I mean, that intelligence documents that were leaked to the Washington Post in 2022, had Putin saying, we're just going to stop competing with the West, militarily. We're just going to just divide them and conquer them from within, because they're just like stealing candy from babies. I mean, those are not his words; those are my words, but more or less that's what he said. And so they devoted a huge amount of money to get involved in our political processes, corrupt our elites, et cetera, et cetera. So I forgot your second question, but I think you said something about like smartphones and the attraction of that. Yeah, no, that's all. When I was in the National Security Council, the White House, during the Trump administration, this was really when Xi Jinping started cracking down on Jack Ma and these social media and technology tycoons, because yes, there's this recognition that on one hand China wants to get rich so it can compete, but on the other hand, as China gets rich, people demand freedom and get freedoms, and technology is rather liberating. Your cell phone's very liberating, and this poses a real threat to the regime. And I think that this is what the regime is realizing. When it comes to economic prosperity versus political control, my assessment is always the regime will go for political control, and economic prosperity be damned.
There's a very good book by the historian David Martin Jones, who unfortunately passed away a couple of months ago, where he talks about what he describes as cultural Maoism, which was this idea that the CCP was in effect influencing left-wing and anti-Western groups in the West in order to try and destabilize. And this strategy has effectively continued to the present day, even from Mao's time. And that includes things like messing with the algorithm on platforms like TikTok. So, for example, a friend of mine who's a sort of political scientist in the UK decided to do an experiment recently where he downloaded TikTok on a sort of burner phone and filmed himself in a park saying that Shenzhen is a giant concentration camp. In Hong Kong, there's no rights, and Christians are suppressed in China, and posted it on TikTok to see what would happen. Within minutes, it was removed, and it was suppressed, and his account was cancelled, and so on. So that's the kind of way that they're already influencing us. I think, Max?
Yes, I think Michael was going to go next, but Declan's gone away, so I'll sort of fill in. I've got a couple of points. I'm going to push back slightly on us not giving the Ukrainians everything. The reason I think a lot of the reason we have to wait so long for F-16s is because there's a 2.5-year training period for pilots, and we're currently bundling Ukrainian pilots trained on MiGs into F-16s for 6-month training. And speaking to senior RAF figures, for example, they're just going, this is hopeless. They'll be shot down very quickly, and I think we're going to begin to see that. And there's been a lot of defenestration of our leading technology from these fighter jets, because seed and deed operations are very dangerous, and we don't want that falling into their hands. So I think that's a big challenge, and probably a reason why we haven't given them as much as they deserve. My other question really was it was mentioned about the far right, and I'm interested on the far left as well, and the decapitalisation of our energy and our security. And it was raised by Declan, basically to have Ireland as the big battery powering Europe. And would that large offshore wind programme take off? I don't think that is a kinetic problem. I think that's a policy problem, fundamentally. I mean, speaking from the UK's perspective, we haven't built a reservoir since the early 90s. The Green Party in our country is awful. They refuse to even build high-speed rail, stuff like that. And I was speaking to Robert Mockery over there from Berlin earlier about the Green Party in Germany and how they're boasting about destroying, not just turning off, destroying the nuclear power plants there. How much concern is that to incumbent policy people on the centre-right, centre-left, but also in the security services about infiltration of green politics and pacifist politics by the Russians and Chinese? Because as far as I'm concerned, green politics is Russian politics. It seeks to defenestrate to the West. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Do you want to take I sort of come in on some of that, which is that the greatest blunder of foreign policy in the last couple of decades was actually Angela Merkel's energy policy. And this idea that they were obsessed with the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and this belief that, okay, if we can, the German economic model was basically an algorithm of if we can get cheap Russian energy in, we can produce expensive luxury goods to sell out. And that's cheap energy from Russia to sell luxury goods to China, which basically meant that they bound us twice. And this had a direct impact actually on policy, because when you go back to the initial Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2015, and the annexation and illegal occupation of Crimea and the proxy war in the Donbass, look at how quickly France and Germany pushed back against British calls to arm Ukraine then. David Cameron at the time was very insistent, as was the Polish government and many others in Central Eastern Europe, that we need to arm Ukraine now so that it can defeat the so-called separatists and retake all of its territory. Whereas Germany and France was running on nuclear power and didn't really care, but most of the uranium came from Russia. And Germany was importing cheap Russian oil and gas. They were so afraid of upsetting the Russians that they forced Ukraine into a bad deal twice with the Normandy Protocol and the Minsk agreements. And they basically told the Ukrainians, your sovereignty be damned, we can't afford an escalation in Europe. And the problem is that they basically gave Russia the time to rearm and reorganize and prepare the second invasion that came a couple of years ago. They used energy policy in order to exploit the weakness of the West. And I completely agree with you that the Greens are entirely culpable of this in the West. And you just have to look back at the Cold War, where the same thing happened again. You had what was described as, by the KGB at the time, as active measures. And this was a policy pursued by the Soviet Union of infiltrating as many left-wing organizations in the West as possible in order to use them to pursue Soviet policy. So things like the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, where they called for the unilateral disarmament of the West, were influenced and financed and funded and organized by the Soviet Union. You had the anti-nuclear energy campaigns organized by the Soviet Union. You had all sorts of other areas where these active measures were deployed. The thing is, those networks were never broken up after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Rather, they were just turned over from the KGB to the FSB, and it carried on as though nothing had changed. And that's why, when it comes to the sort of fellow travelers who have been reluctant to call for support for Ukraine, for example, Die Linke in Germany, or people like Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, or the far left in France, or even Sinn Féin in Ireland, it's because they were fellow travelers during the Soviet time, and these assets have been kept alive and active all the way up until the present time.
Thank you. When I hear terms like misinformation or disinformation, and even sometimes Russian interference, an alarm bell goes off in my head, because I think they've become sort of diluted of their meaning. A bit like racism. They obviate the need to think about what your opponent is saying, and they're often weaponized in, as you saw with the post-2016 election in America, where it was meant to have been stolen by Russian bots, of which we now know probably had a negligible effect on that election. And so I'm just wondering if you think that we're almost letting Russia and this nebulous threat of malign actors polluting our airways rather live in our head rent-free a bit too much, and actually the derangement of our society cuts both ways, in that it's not only the direct effect of misinformation, which undoubtedly is weaponized by these powers, but also the hysterical response that we have to that very real threat, and that overestimates its importance to a large degree. Like when I hear talk about people gullible, knuckle-dragging idiots falling for misinformation and being ventriloquized by Vladimir Putin to think Irish for the Irish or whatever, with all due respect, that's what Ireland was founded on. They don't need to, they can look to Padraig Pearse, or they can look to their own traditions for that. So that's the first part of my question. Second is, to Declan. All across Europe, we're actually seeing a rather different fifth column to the one you alluded to. It's not necessarily the native-born populations, but if you look at Sweden, for example, the Kurdistani mafia, which is the dominant mafia in Sweden, has been used by Iran to target Jews in Sweden. The Mokro mafia in Holland reached a Pablo Escobar level of threat to the state a few years ago, such that the heir to the Dutch throne actually had to flee the country and go into hiding in Madrid. Do you worry about that as a security concern for Ireland?
Not primarily, not just me, but my former colleagues who deal with these things. This kind of ties in with sort of an answer I'll give to some of the points you were making earlier. I understand to an extent what's happening there, in that you talked about that mafia. They're well embedded. They have a good operating platform. If you were looking to try and influence things from the outside in, you look at who's established, who has the power, who has the influence. In that case, it's as you outlined it. In the Irish case, there aren't too many external factors that are embedded, external organisations, shall we say. There's no organised crime group in Ireland that's external that would have that kind of clout.
Possibly not yet, but the Black Axe Nigerian gang, for example, there's been dozens of those arrested in Ireland. So
True.
We have a lot of case studies to see which way the wind blows in terms of mass migration from certain countries and the organised criminality.
Yeah. No, I hear you. To answer the question at its most simple, Ireland's biggest defence is that it is still a small society. It's still a largely homogenous society. Now, obviously, there's been a lot of migration. There are a lot of people coming from different parts of the world where they would be influenced by extremist groupings. But what we're seeing happening is, and it hasn't been a strategy, it has been something that has generally happened, but there's a greater recognition now that we need to make it more cohesive at an institutional level. And that is harnessing people as they come in, hibernicizing them, so that that not just their loyalties are to this state, but that they become encultured, they become part of it. One of the most cohesive organisations in Ireland that has had a positive effect in bedding in people from different parts of the world has been the GAA, for those of you not familiar with it, the Gaelic Athletics Association. Every parish in Ireland has a vibrant GAA club. And I'm just using that as an example. This kind of soft power example is one that can ensure that you won't have people staying within the realm of extremist groupings they might have been exposed to. Now, I'm not saying that's the only answer, but there is no evidence of within from the security services perspective, of that kind of threat manifesting. However, what we do have to pay a lot of attention to, and there's a former colleague of mine working on this at the moment, is the shall we say, metamorphosis of our more traditional terrorist groupings. So whether they're the old redundant provisional IRA men who never quite made the political jump and who don't see Sinn Féin as being a legitimate entity to support anymore, whether it's some of the more extreme elements that would have supported the Irish Republican Socialist Party, which is interesting. If you look up a guy called Malachy Steenson, who is an independent Dublin City Councillor, who has now become a de facto spokesman for the far right in Ireland. He had a militant far left Republican background and was involved. Actually, he did time for offences related to the Republican movement. And variations on that. They still exist. The networks for some of those organisations still exist. Some of them have morphed into criminal enterprises, but they are very much available to people who want to supply them with funding, weaponry, and whatever else to do their bidding. And that they're being closely watched. At the moment, they're pretty well riddled with informants, which has been to the benefit of both Dublin and London in terms of dealing with these groups up around the border. But they have become very much criminalised And their objectives are not the same as they were 20, 30 years ago. And they would be, to go back to your parlance, they would be the equivalent threat to Ireland if they're not monitored properly, and if their permutations and, shall we say, mutations are not properly monitored. And that's not to dismiss your other point, and I don't think it should be, but it's not something that looks like an emerging threat for Ireland in the same way. Does that answer your question?
It does. I think it might be an example of that horizon thinking you were talking about earlier, in that I don't see how Ireland is going to prove the exception to the general rule of lawlessness, pockets of lawlessness that we're seeing across Western Europe, specifically from exactly the demographics that you're now enforcing.
Yeah, there's something else you said there as well that it just reminded me of that I wanted to come back to. The idea that, I suppose, that these extremist ideas come into a country, are something that we shouldn't dismiss. But I think the size of the country has a lot to do with it. That while we're a wide open society, it's still very hard for extremist elements that are not of Irish society to exist without coming onto the security radar. The problem with ones that are homegrown is that they have an ability to network and move because of age-old sympathies that exist within regions. You only have to go up to the border regions of Ireland, the border region of Ireland, either north or south, to see what is effectively elements of little fiefdoms, where their alliances and their allegiances are purely to these little groupings and not to either state. And locals will either fall into giving that allegiance or try and stay aloof from it completely. I don't really see that happening in the same way within the immigrant community in Ireland, because they seem to be, they're being diversified in terms of where they're being sent and where they're being put. And those that are staying are getting subsumed into communities. I think it's one of the advantages of being a small state. And again, certainly in terms of the security service monitoring, they don't see that as a long-term issue. However, there is something else that you said too, and I suppose it should be addressed. I agree with your point that a lot of people put the big bad Russian boogeyman is causing all this trouble in different parts of Europe. I think where the Russians have succeeded, it's scratching an itch that already exists within a society. So their success to disrupt will be based on how culturally literate they are. They've been very clumsy in Ireland, but it hasn't mattered because the itch has been there. So the issue about resources and migration, just to use that as an example, that's an issue that hasn't been well managed by a succession of Irish governments because they didn't think it was a big issue. So it didn't take a whole lot of effort. It doesn't take a whole lot of expertise if you're looking from the outside in to stir that pot. And that is what we have to really be careful about. Not getting obsessed, as you say, about the external influence, but being aware of it, not ignoring it, but also fixing the problem in your own backyard. And I think good governance is the key to that, and good communication between government and citizenry. And that's something we have to work on a bit more in Ireland at the moment.
In 30 seconds.
Yeah, very quickly. If I could, just on the Russian disinformation thing. So you'll see that it's the Democratic Party who is always the one claiming, Russian disinformation. And this is a form of projection. This is in itself is disinformation. So what we know for a fact is in the wake of Russiagate, the Department of Justice Inspector General did several exhaustive reports on where did this Steele dossier come from. And it concluded that this was highly influenced by Russian disinformation. And we even know the names of the Russian spies who were involved. I know the names of them. Number one. This was an incredibly successful operation. The reason why is that you have a Russian disinformation-filled Steele dossier that then gets inserted into the 2017 Intelligence Community Assessment. So you take Russian disinformation, you turn it into a U.S. intelligence product, and then you use that U.S. intelligence product as the predicate, the legal predicate, to launch the Mueller investigation that essentially ties America up in knots for 3 years of the Trump administration. So what the Russians did through their disinformation was divide America in a way more severely than we've been divided since the Civil War. in 1865. It was phenomenally successful. Russian spies, toasted one another with vodka shots for, 6 months afterwards. I mean, it was astonishingly successful. And then you see Putin's reaction, which is doubling down on this sort of operation. So Democrats are very much tied in with the Russians. And, look, I mean, Hillary was collaborating with them to develop the Steele dossier. We know that for a fact. Not even a discussion. But just very quickly on the F-16s, which I think is a very important point, is that since 2014, the U.S. military, as well as NATO, has been training the Ukrainian military. We very deliberately excluded training them to fly F-16s, number one. We trained them to do lots of other things, and so Russia's initial invasion from the north was quite successfully pushed back because of NATO and U.S. training. If you look at what the Pentagon has been saying for the entirety of this war, the Pentagon has been inordinately concerned with escalating the war. We didn't give the Ukrainians M1A1 tanks because we were so afraid that this would escalate. This fear of escalation has really, really retarded America's desire to give Ukraine the weapons they want. If we were serious about the Ukrainians winning, we would have trained them on F-16 starting in 2014. We would have had plenty of time, but we weren't. We didn't want them to have that capability.
Good. I'm afraid we've run out of time there, so I'd like to thank the panelists for their contributions. We now have a very quick coffee break, and then at 4 o'clock we've got the bus to Dublin for the walking tour. So thank you.